Well, good evening. I get all my papers that I've stuffed my Bible with this morning. We're going to ask you tonight if you will turn to Exodus chapter 24, please. Exodus chapter 24. On Sunday night, we've been trying to, in our class here, to talk about Old Testament events that are a teaching tool for us who are under the New Testament. And we've been talking about the children of Israel leaving Egypt and going into, or at least going to the edge of the Promised Land. Last week we talked about Rahab, and someone stopped me at the end of service last week as they left and said, you know, Rahab needs to be preached more often because her faith was a genuine faith built primarily or entirely on what she had heard God had done. And just think how many times the gospel is preached and there aren't any responses to it. But she did. I want tonight to talk about Genesis chapter 24 and chapter 32. I'd love to read them to you, but I'm not going to do that. I will read a little bit, and let me give you the context of where we're going to begin tonight. In Exodus chapter 24, the children of Israel have left Egypt. They've been through on dry land in the Red Sea. They've wandered for a few months, and God has brought them very close to the edge of the Promised Land. And at this point, God is ready to give Moses what we commonly call the Ten Commandments, or the law of Moses. In the previous chapters, God has already given them instructions, so some of the parts of the law of Moses have already been given, but many of the details have not been given, and God is ready to do that. He's ready to write what we call the Ten Commandments on table of stones. Now, of all of the things I want you to think about tonight, I want to begin with this. It's interesting that in these chapters, God wrote the Ten Commandments on tables of stone using what? Whose finger? That fascinates me, since God doesn't have any fingers. It's figurative, of course. I do not know the language of the Jews at this point. It's later the Hebrew language, of course. But God wrote it in such a way that those people living then could read it. That's also interesting. But let's look at the beginning of chapter 24, just a couple verses here. Verse 1, and he, that is God, said unto Moses, come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship afar off. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come near, neither shall the people go up with them. Now, in the verses that follow, we understand that these 70 elders, Aaron, he's our theme tonight, by the way, Aaron and his two sons, Nadab and Abihu, are to go up part way up on Mount Sinai and worship. But only Moses is to go all the way up. Now, we do know that Moses took his minister with him. That's what it's called in the King James. And that's Joshua. But Joshua didn't go all the way. So we have these men, and in the verses that follow, it says they saw God. Now you can read those verses all you want, and you will walk away from that reading thinking, what did they see? No man has seen God. God hath no form as a human being, but they saw something that God had done, And so the writer here, Moses, says they saw God. And then Moses went up into the mountain. After 6 days of fog and clouds that overrode the mountain, on the seventh day, God called Moses to the top. And Moses was there receiving the 10 Commandments for quite some time. How many days was he there? Anybody know? 40 days and 40 nights. I believe it's in the last verse, isn't it? The last verse of the 24th chapter. Moses was there 40 days and 40 nights. Now, we're going to leave Moses up there. Let him stay up there because that's not really our subject tonight. Now I want you to turn over to chapter 32, or 34, excuse me. Did I get the wrong chapter here? 32, yes, I was right the first time. Notice that, by the way, the intervening chapters are instructions that God gave to Moses in building the tabernacle, what the priests were to wear, and the minute details of the priesthood and sacrifices and so forth. So that's what's going on, and we've skipped that. Now, chapter 32, look at the first verse. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, King James says, up, or we would say in our language, get up, make us gods that shall go before us, for as for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we know not what has become of him. Now, I want to put you there for a moment. Here are the children of Israel that are camped there before Mount Sinai. For 6 days they have witnessed the clouds over the mountain. On the seventh day they've been told and they understand, and undoubtedly they saw something. Moses went up to the top of the mountain. The mountain shook. There was a cloud encompassing it. What did they have for breakfast that morning? What did they have? Everybody in the room knows. What did they have? Manna. Where did it come from? From the heavens above, God's miraculous. These people just a few months before had passed through the Red Sea. Okay? Now there's something in chapter 24 I didn't read to you. 2 times in chapter 24, if my memory serves me correct, Moses gave them God's instructions before he went up to the mountain. And both times the people said, we will obey the will of God and keep His commandments. Okay? 2 times. They've witnessed the miracles in Egypt. They've been through the Red Sea. God's fed them breakfast and their stomach is digesting it. And they have proclaimed they're going to obey the will of God and keep His commandments. Now, Moses has been up on the mountain for a little less than 6 weeks. And they're restless. Somebody might add, maybe they're afraid. Or for whatever human reason, they gather to Aaron and say, Aaron, make us gods that will lead us. Now, that's the picture. Now let's turn our attention to Aaron. Everybody in the room understands that Aaron is Moses' older or younger brother? Older brother. There are how many children in that family? 3 that we know of. Aaron, Miriam, and baby Moses. He's the youngest of the bunch. Aaron, of course, has been Moses' spokesman. And when you go back and read about the 10 plagues again, it's often Aaron who's actually doing what God has instructed Moses to tell him to do. In other words, one time Moses cast down his rod, remember, and it turned into a serpent snake and ate up the snakes that were created by the magicians. But other times it's Aaron. Now Aaron is spoken to by God on a number of occasions. So here's a man that knows Moses, it's his brother. He knows what God's instructions are. He knows a lot about what is happening. Also, before Moses went up into the mountain, Moses gave instructions to Aaron. He said, Aaron, if there's a conflict among some people, among our people, among the Hebrews, you be the judge. I'm going to go. You and Hur, H-U-R. They were going to be the judge. So now 6 weeks later, they come to Aaron and say, Aaron, make us gods. Now, how does he respond? Thou shalt have no other gods before thee. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Is that what he responded as? What did he say to do? Yeah, take your gold off your kids and anywhere else you got it and bring it to me. Now, I don't need to read you what happened, do I? But I do want to read it. I want to read something here. Well, yes, I do. Verse 4, I want you to pay real close attention. And Aaron received them, that is the gold objects, at their hand, and he fashioned it with a graving tool after he had made it a molten calf. Now I want you to keep that in mind. By the way, in 1990 something, I don't know, which seems like yesterday, but then seems like an eternity, some archaeologists in that part of the world made a discovery that had never been made before. That is, the object they found, they'd never found one prior to that. And what they found was a golden calf, an image made out of gold. It was about 3.5 inches tall. And, gold's pretty precious, but they had found literally a golden calf, very small. We don't know what Aaron made here. Was it bigger than that? In the Sunday school literature that we have for our children, the calf is as big as a cow's calf, but there's no evidence either way. But notice he took the gold and he fashioned it, or had it fashioned, with a graving tool. By the way, in the previous verses, in the previous chapters, God gave some of these Hebrews exceptional talent in making things. And one of them is in various cloth material and others in stone and undoubtedly gold also. So he made it. And then what did he do? Look in the next verse. We won't read it. In the next verse, he built an altar in front of it. To do what? To sacrifice. And then number 2, he proclaimed a feast day. Notice what it says. He proclaimed a feast day unto who? The Lord. And then the King James Version tells us that they ate and they drank. And also it says in verses 25, and Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto their shame among their enemies. Other translations says Aaron made them shameful to the nations around them. But the truth of the matter is, here just a few weeks before, they'd proclaimed their loyalty to God. They're going to keep all of His commandments. And in 6 short weeks, they're worshiping an idol god that they've made and dancing around it like a bunch of pagans. Now, you have to read the whole story to know that not everybody was doing that. There were those that did not. But it seems that there were quite a few who were. And at this point, God speaks to Moses up there on the mountain. He says, in essence, get down to the mountain, from the mountain, because the people down there are shaming themselves, and He calls them a stiff-necked people. So last week, I decided to go to the concordance and the lexicon, rather, not the concordance, the Hebrew concordance, and look up the words stiff neck or stiff-necked. And you know what it means? Stubborn. Stubborn. Who in the New Testament used the same word to describe the same folks? Stephen did. Acts chapter 7. He said they were stiff-necked people. In other words, stubborn. One other word we might use in there is they were self-willed. We're going to do it our way. Okay? But anyway, I want to go on and look at some other things with you. Moses came down from the mountain. You know what he did. He was so angry that he threw the tables of stone with the commandments on it and broke it. I don't know what that meant in the sense, do we do things that are irrational when we're mad? Nobody in here I know would, but anyway. You know, I've seen men get real mad, take their fist and hit the wall. You know all that does? Puts a hole in the wall and makes your hand hurt. I worked in an emergency room in a hospital years ago, and somebody came in with their hand was all bloody and they were hurting. And the doctor said, "What'd you do?" He said, "I got mad and hit the concrete wall." And his fingers were, really bad shape. Moses threw the tables of stone down. They were broken. And Moses is angry. He waxed hot, as we would say. And the King James uses a phrase nearly like that. And Moses went to his brother Aaron, and I want to look at that with you. We're in the 32nd chapter. Well, let's start in verse 19. And it came to pass, as soon as Moses came nigh unto the camp, and he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hand and brake them beneath the mount. And he took the calf, which they had made, burned it in the fire, ground it to a powder, and strewed it upon the water, and made the children of Israel drink it. You can drink your idol. But here's what I want you to look at. And verse 21. And Moses said unto Aaron, what did this people unto thee, that thou hast brought so great a sin upon them? We'd put it this way. What did they do to you that led you to do this? Look at his reply. And Aaron said, let not thine anger of my Lord wax hot. Lord here referring to Moses. In other words, don't get mad. Look at the next phrase. Thou knowest the people, that they are set on mischief. Who's he putting the blame on? Now, he goes on and illustrates what happened in the next phrase. For they said unto me, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we know not what is become of him. And I said unto them, whosoever hath any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it me. Now listen to this. And I cast it into the fire, and there came out this calf. Remember that verse we read back in the other chapter? What did he do? He took a tool and made it. When I read that, I think of evolutionists. We just, all of a sudden, I was reading the other day something they'd written, and I'd heard it before that so many million years ago, all of a sudden these birds lost their wings and became some kind of animal that walked on all four, but they didn't have four, they only had two, but they got two more. It just happened. So he put the gold in, and out it came, a calf. In chapter 20, where the Ten Commandments are given, and the chapters that follow, is one of the high points of the children of Israel. Okay? They received God's law, or at least part of it. They dedicated themselves to God. They promised repeatedly to obey His words, keep His commandments. It appeared that all of a sudden we were going to have now picture this, a whole nation of people for the first time on the face of the earth that were totally, wholeheartedly, genuinely dedicated to serve the God of heaven. That's the high point of the nation of Israel. A few chapters later, they're still eating God's miraculous food. We're still seeing the thunderous mountain. We're still enjoying the quail. We're still being watered miraculously by God. And Moses is gone for 40 days. They know where he's gone. They know why he's gone. And for reasons that we could talk about and argue about or whatever all day long, they decided to turn their backs on all of that. And let's go back to Egypt and let's worship some idol god. In other words, we're at the peak, and by the time we get to chapter 32, we're at the bottom.
I've always thought it was because Aaron was basically a coward, because they basically probably threatened him, and he said, all right, I'll do it. You know, he wasn't willing to stand up for what he knew was right. He just wasn't willing to stand up.
Well, you're absolutely correct. Aaron here is a weak man. Did he have the power to do miraculous things? I don't know. He did in previous years or days, but he backed down. What I want us to see here is that there's a pattern. Now let's move ahead real fast and look at something. These people went up to the mountain, did not go to the promised land until God allowed Moses to return to the mountain again. They got the tablets of stone again. Then they went up to the promised land. Then we talked about the 12 spies. God said, you can't go in. They wandered for 40 years, and a new generation came, right? And this new generation we read about, we look at them and they say, now these folks have faith, right? These folks have faith. They did, Nathan, for a while. They entered the promised land, and it was not very long until they were enticed by the idol gods of that country. And guess where they go? Down. How many times in the Old Testament did God's people do what He asked them to do, And then they started the other way, downhill. Then God would send prophets. He would warn them. They were smitten with plagues. They were defeated by their enemies. And then they humbly returned, and the cycle went on again. Now, let's bring that to us. When the New Testament church came into existence in Acts chapter 2, and we read the opening, 13 chapters, and we get real excited about how the church was growing, right? It grew rapidly. Everywhere people went, they went preaching the word, and it was a wonderful period of history. And then we get into the Apostle Paul's missionary journeys at the end of the book of Acts, and we admire Paul for what he did, and we recognize that he had a hard time, but yet the church was established, little congregations here and there, some in the big cities, some in smaller towns, certainly, and we are really pleased. And a high point among the growth of the church. And then we go to the letters. And Paul says in these letters, to the Ephesian elders, for example, he said, the time's going to come when there will be men that will arise even from your number who will teach things to draw men away. So, first of all, we know the time was going to come when there would be false teachers in the church. And then we read over about Diotrephes, who wanted to have his will done in the church. And he acted, to put it mildly, unchristian. And John says, when I get there, I'm going to do what's necessary. Interesting, John didn't say what. And then in 2 Thessalonians, the Thessalonians are like a lot of people today, and even some churches. They get hung up on certain things. They got hung up on the teaching that Christ was going to return, and they wanted to be ready for him because they thought it was going to be next week or next month or whatever. And the indication in Paul's letter is that they more or less sold everything they got and were setting up on top of a mountain waiting on the Lord to come. And Paul wrote them, and by the way, that happened in America in 1844. There was a religious group in New England said, the Lord's coming back this year. So everybody sold everything they got and put it into cash, put it in their pockets, went up onto the mountain and stayed there for 3 weeks, and he didn't come. I've always interested, if the Lord's coming in 3 weeks, what are you going to use your money for? Take it with you, I guess. Paul wrote him a letter, and he said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that's not going to happen until there first come a falling away, and talking about the Christian faith. And then in Timothy, he wrote, the time will come when there will be men that will lead folks astray. And he mentioned some of the things that would happen. So in the history of the church, folks, you have this high point, and then you have all of this downward trend. But the church never totally dies out. I was reading about a group this past week. I don't know how you pronounce the name of them. It's a German name, and I'm not good in that. I don't speak the Deutsch. But they were called by the region where they lived. And they referred to the church as the Church of Christ. But their enemies did not call them that or refer to the Church of Christ. They referred to them by the region where they lived. And they were persecuted and tortured and pretty much destroyed there, and so forth and so on. Well, here we have a movement in the United States to get back to the point. And Churches of Christ in the United States reached a peak right after World War II. You couldn't pick up an article about Churches of Christ from the FBI down to literature that's put out by members of the church that it wasn't growing. Do you realize when Dale Reed was born, there was not a single Church of Christ in New England? There wasn't a single Church of Christ in Alaska. There wasn't a single Church of Christ in North and South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming, and Washington State. There were in Oregon. But after World War II, the church grew tremendously. Matter of fact, there's a little country church in the mountains of Maine, I noticed the other day, have about 100 members. They're looking for a preacher. There weren't 100 members of the church in the whole region. And now there are congregations of the Churches of Christ in every state in the Union, including Alaska. And you can ask Dan Bennett when he comes by sometime how many there are. There are lots of them. But the point is, we reached a peak. And now we're going the other way again. So Leroy was talking about this the other night. I think it's past Wednesday night, if my memory's right, that church growth is like a pendulum, back and forth. Reach peaks, and then we go the other way, and then back again. That's been the history of mankind, folks. And the Hebrew people demonstrated. I've heard people say to me, I don't know, if God would do something today to show to the world that there is a God and He's all powerful, then we wouldn't be in the mess we're in. Folks, anybody that says that hasn't read their Bible very much. First of all, Jesus said, when He told the story of the rich man and Lazarus, remember? And Lazarus was in paradise, the rich man was in torment, and the rich man said, all I want you to do is send somebody back to earth from the dead, and my brothers will believe it. And remember what Jesus' response was, God's response? And they won't believe the writings of the Old Testament, that was all that was available. Then they won't believe if somebody comes back from the dead. Listen, I can go to Mansfield tomorrow and say, you know, I died 2 years ago, and I've just come back from the dead. The sheriff will send a deputy out on the street and pick me up and take me out to the hospital. The children of Israel witnessed God. Remember the 70 elders? It says they saw God. Now, exactly what they saw, but they saw God. They were eating the miracles. They were living by the miracles of God. What else could God do to convince them? And the cycle begins, and it begins, and it begins, and begins. Well, thank you for your attention tonight, and I hope we can keep these things in mind because we all have to deal with them in our lives. I ask you to take your hymn book and turn to the hymn, and I looked it up, Jerry, to see what it was, and you know I've already forgotten it. I know, but what's the song? There's Within My Heart a Melody. One of my favorite hymns. If you have a need to respond to the invitation, do so now while we stand and sing a couple verses of that song, please.